Welcome. Today we will talk about the Roman Republic. Let's discuss what this republic was and how it started, because this is the way Rome began. We can talk about first the aspect of the beginning of the Roman race, that is, those people who called themselves Romans. It began with a story called the Aeneid. That's a story of a man named Aeneas who was a Trojan prince, and he was told by the gods, those favorable to Troy and favorable to Rome, to leave Troy and to found a new race in Italy. Here we see a statue of Aeneas done by Bernini, and Aeneas is carrying his father, an old man who is too ill to walk, and pulling behind him his young boy. His wife had died. Then the story of Aeneas continues as he gets on the boat and looks behind to see the destruction of Troy from, as you know, the Greeks entered inside the Trojan horse and then sacked the city. That's the time when Aeneas leaves. He gets in his boat and he sails off, searching for this land called Italy, where he would found this special race of people. He has many interesting encounters in the 10 years that he wanders through the Mediterranean. One of those encounters especially happened when he arrived at Carthage. There he meets and falls in love with the queen of Carthage. Her name is Dido. Dido's already married, but Dido also falls in love with Aeneas and they have an affair. Eventually, the gods come to Aeneas and remind him that he must leave and found his race in the city or in the land of Italy. So Aeneas leaves. Dido laments greatly and in fact commits suicide because of Aeneas's leaving. He then sails and eventually comes to the land of the Aetolians, the land of Italy. And there he falls in love with the daughter of the king, and they marry, but the daughter had been previously promised to someone else. And those tribes that backed the other now dejected and rejected fiancé, they rebel against the Aetolians and try and kill the Aetolians. But Aeneas, in his bravery and with the help of the gods, is able to withstand the onslaught of all of these other tribes, though it takes another 10 years. Hence, the race of people that we call the Romans were founded through this difficult 20-year period, the first 10 years of wandering, the second 10 years of fighting. Now, if that sounds a little bit familiar, it ought to. It is, of course, the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, somewhat adjusted and reversed. In the case of Aeneas, it's the wanderings first and then the war after, as, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey are the other way around. But this is the legend of the founding of Rome. The area where he landed in Italy is called Latium, because the people there spoke the Latin language. And that, of course, is the origin of the Roman language as well. Here we see a map that shows the journey, and of course this is all approximate because we don't know for sure some of these places, but it's from where he left from Troy and finally ended up in Latium. You might ask, is this true? Well, many of the places mentioned, we know they really did exist, and we know that there was a tribe called the Latiums in this land of Italy where the Aetolians lived, and therefore there's some reasonable expectation that this story could have had some truth to it, and the founding of these people was probably about right for around 1100 BC, which is the period of time that we would have expected for the Trojan War. So there's enough truth that it was probably true, at least certain phases of it. I think it is interesting, however, that this story gives the Romans an ancient heritage equivalent to the ancient heritage of the Greeks. And later, of course, when the Romans take over the Greeks, the Romans want to have this magnificent heritage as well. And so the story may have been refurbished and expanded just for the Roman psyche to make them feel better. There's also an interesting point that this dilemma with Dido, who is from Carthage, is associated with the early Roman Republic's biggest enemy, and that was Carthage. And so here again, those important conquest areas for the Romans, Carthage, Greece, perhaps others, were included in the story of Aeneas. And maybe there is some reason for that inclusion. We don't know, but it's an interesting story. Now, that's the founding of the Roman race, but not the founding of the city or kingdom of Rome itself. That has another story associated with it, begins somewhat later, and it begins, with the story of Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus are actually associated with a king who is descended from Aeneas. So there's this lineal descent down to a king, but this king is the last male in his line. He has a daughter, but the daughter was a Vestal virgin and therefore not able to have children. Let me explain. There was a temple to the goddess of Vesta, and there were, as I remember, 20 Vestal virgins. They promised that they would have no association with men at all while they were Vestal virgins, and they were there for 20 years. If any Vestal virgin became pregnant or otherwise had an intimate association with a man, then she would be buried alive. Therefore, it was fairly certain that this daughter of the king, a Vestal virgin, would go throughout her life without children. However, she became pregnant. She says that it was because the god Mars raped her. Well, if that's the case, then she could not be punished. Eventually, she had twins. She named them Romulus and Remus, but the new king who had taken over for her father was very angry and felt very threatened by these two young infants. And therefore, he ordered that the infants be cast into the Tiber River to drown them and, of course, eliminate any possibility of competition for his throne. The two little infant babies floated down the river, eventually coming to a sandbar on an island in the river where they stuck, and in the crying of hunger that they logically had, a she-wolf came, and she suckled these two children and then carried them over into dry land where they were eventually picked up by shepherds and reared to adulthood. They then founded the city of Rome on the place where near the place where they had been suckled by the she-wolf. There is some historical evidence of a hut dating from about this period of time, around 800 BC, and people in Rome call this hut Romulus's hut. So there's some reasonable historical evidence that at least there was a settlement in the area of Rome at about that right time. Now, what happened to Romulus and Remus? They had a fight over the height of the walls that would surround the city. Possibly even if that fight included how to name the city. Romulus won, Remus was killed, and the name of the city was Rome. There are further stories about the founding, expanding of the city of Rome. One of them has to do with the fact that Rome initially was an open city. Anybody who wanted to could come. They needed the population. And so all types of people came from all types of ethnic groups, even though the original descendants of Aeneas were still kings for a while. And then eventually some of the difficulties occurred in that this was a rough and tumble town, a place where mostly men lived, and they were so tough and rough and what we would call frontiersmen that the women didn't want to go in. However, there is a story of how women came to the city. The story is illustrated by this painting by Jacques-Louis David called The Sabine Women. The story goes something like this. The men of Rome decided that they needed to have wives, and they couldn't convince any women to come. So they invited one of the neighboring tribes called the Sabines to come on down for a picnic. They had a great picnic there outside the walls of Rome, and the Sabines and the Romans were mingling and they were happy. And each of the Roman men seized one of the Sabine women, daughters we think, and carried that daughter into the city and locked the gates. The Sabine men, who were probably either drunk or sleeping, were shut out, and they were shocked, of course, when their daughters were taken captive by the Roman men. Nevertheless, they couldn't do anything about it because they didn't have sufficient force to storm the city. So they went back to the land of the Sabines, gathered an army, and about a year later they returned. When they returned, they laid siege to the city, but the Roman men, realizing that they might be in trouble from this siege, sent their wives and the now baby children out to plead for the saving of the city of Rome. And so the Sabine women put themselves between their fathers and brothers and the city of Rome, convinced the Sabine men that they should leave, and therefore the Roman city was saved by the Sabine women. Another story is that during the period of development of the city of Rome, there were several wars. In one case, the Romans left the city, went over the only bridge over the Tiber River, and they went off to attack one of the neighboring tribes that had been giving them trouble. The attack proved to be a disaster, and the Romans had to retreat very quickly. As they came back toward this only bridge, they realized that the other group would cross the bridge and destroy the Roman city. Therefore, one of the captains of the Romans, a man named Horatio, instructed all of the rest of the army to go across the bridge, and he said, "I will stand on the edge of the bridge and I will protect it until you have been able to destroy the bridge and therefore prevent the army from crossing and save the city." A few men volunteered to stand with Horatio at the bridge and fight off this invading army. Eventually, even those men were told by Horatio, "Go back. I can feel the bridge moving and swaying. They've almost succeeded in chopping the bridge free from its moorings." And then finally, at the last moment, the bridge gave way. Horatio jumped in the water. He should have died with his armor on, but miraculously he floated enough that the Roman army was able to save him, and Horatio became a hero, a man dedicated to Rome to such an extent that he willingly would have given his life for the city. Another great story, again illustrated by a painting by Jacques-Louis David, is the oath of the Horates. There were 3 Horati brothers, Romans, who were challenged by 3 brothers from a neighboring warring tribe. It's much like the story of David and Goliath. Whoever won in a battle between these 2 groups of 3 brothers their tribe would win and have dominance over the others. Well, the 3 Horati brothers went out and fought against the 3 brothers from the other tribe. And in the midst of all of that fighting, 2 of the Horati brothers were killed. The 3rd Horati brother, realizing that he could no way fight and dominate 3 at a time, began to run. And he ran as fast as he could, and the other brothers ran after him. but they could not run at the same speed, and they eventually lengthened the distance between them. Eventually, the Herati brother turned quickly and fought the first man who came to him and killed him. Then he fought the second and killed him, and finally the third and killed him. Then the Herati brother in his happiness returned home and told his father and his family about his success. He looked over at one of his sisters. Here you see in the picture, one sister is in deep sorrow. And he said, "Why are you so sorrowful? Why are you crying?" And she said, "It's because one of the three brothers that you killed was my fiancé." The Herati brother looked at her, drew his sword, and cut off her head. The reason he did it, he said, was because everyone should be willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of Rome. Well, some interesting stories. They teach the principles on which Rome was founded. These guiding principles are very strong ethical behavior, devotion to the city of Rome, and honesty and truth and law-abiding. All of those are values that were very important to the Roman Republic and important to what they wanted to prove. Well, eventually, the Romans were ruled by these kings for a period of many, many years. There were, by tradition, 7 kings, although the period of time covered by the 7 kings would make each of the kings live about 120 years. So there probably were more than 7 kings, but nevertheless 7 have been identified and are featured as the magic number. Rome has lots of things about 7, including 7 hills. There are actually more than 7 hills, but there are 7 principal hills. Maybe that's the story of the kings as well. The last of these 7 kings proved to be a terrible tyrant and despot. He was cruel to the Romans. He was actually from a tribe other than the original tribe descended from Aeneas. He was overthrown, and at that point the Romans said, "We will never have a king again. We want a new government based on the principles that we have established." And therefore, they investigated all kinds of governments. And to do that, they used the Aristotelian method. Let's just take a note here of what the Aristotelian method said by way of review from a previous lecture. If a single person is a ruler, and that single ruler is stable, then we call that a monarchy. If that single person is unstable, then we call that person a despot. If it's a small group that rules and they are stable, we call it an aristocracy. If that small group is unstable or is predatory or mean, we call them an oligarchy. And finally, if there is a large group that rules and they are stable, we call it a polity. That means that they abide by a constitution. If they are an unstable form, we call that a democracy, which means a mob rule. I think Aristotle remembered what had happened to Socrates, where he was killed by the democracy because they acted like a mob rule. Much better to have a polity where there is a constitution to guide them, rather than each person making their own individual choice without any written document as a guide. Well, what would the Romans choose? Obviously, they want to have a stable form, and they saw advantages in single person, small group, and large group rule. And therefore, they created a new kind of government. They took the best of all 3 stable forms and put them together, and they called it a republic. And let's take a look at the features of what that republic is. First of all, the republic was ruled by a small group called the Senate and by the people. The people are called the plebs, and therefore the symbol of Rome, if you like, or the motto, the slogan of Rome is Senatus Populus Q Romanus. Don't know if I said that right, but it's SPQR. And this concept of SPQR, or the symbol, is everywhere in Rome. it's on walls, it's even on the sidewalks and access for the waterworks and other things. It is simply ubiquitous in Rome today. Well, what were the concepts of how the Senate, they were the fathers or the patricians, and the people, the plebs, how did they work together? Let's take the case of the Senate and see what it did. The Senate, first of all, appointed the executive leaders of the city. These executive leaders were called consuls. There were two of them, check and balance. Very important in the Roman system to have checks and balances. To make sure that the consuls were never too powerful, they had a limit of a 1-year term, and every year there would be a new consul, of course, or 2 new consuls every year. They served without pay, simply because it was part of their public duty. The Senate also had control over foreign affairs, that is, everything that happened outside the city of Rome. So warfare and negotiations on treaties, perhaps trade and the funding of armies that would go out and fight, all of that came under the control of the Senate. If the army was to go on war, then there had to be a special act created by the Senate. This was called the imperium. It was an empowerment. Much like today in the United States, the Senate of the United States has to declare war. That's also the case of the Senate in ancient Rome. They had to declare war. And therefore, the word imperium is indicative of giving them the power to go and conduct war. It's interesting that as the army over many centuries expanded and conducted war at ever greater fields, then their imperium would become known as the empire. The words have a similar origin. Finally, there were some times of great difficulty, perhaps an invasion by another tribe or a collapse of the economy or some very serious problem. The Senate could meet together and they would have the authority that for a short period of time, one instance says that it was limited to 6 months and no more, that they would be able to elect a person who had total power. He would be able to override all of the normal checks and balances. This person would be chosen by the Senate, and they would talk through who this person would be, often choosing the person who was the eldest and most wise of the senators, usually assumed to be the same person. And that person would be the Speaker of the Senate, the dictator of the Senate. The word dictator and speaker are the same. And therefore, a short period of time, the Senate could choose a dictator who could override all of the checks and balances and solve the problem. As soon as the problem was solved, or as soon as the time frame came up, whichever was shorter, then the dictator would relinquish his power. Now let's look at the great other council, the plebeian council. They were the counterbalance to the Senate. They had control over all of the domestic affairs within the city of Rome. And this council had no patricians on it. It was headed by a group of 10 plebeians, and they were called tribunes. Now these 10 tribunes, and the word tribune comes from tribe, because the plebeians were organized roughly into tribes, they would be able to make all of the laws of the city. The Senate didn't make the laws. Only the plebeian council could make the law. However, the Senate usually made recommendations to the tribunes, who would then present it to the plebeian council for a law to be enacted. So there was obviously a cooperation between the two, and when there was no cooperation, there were problems in the Roman system, and they had to change their system, gradually evolving it until they could work out these problems. By the way, if any of the 10 tribunes was against any law, he had veto power. So all 10 tribunes have to be in agreement. Well, it's an interesting legal system, an interesting form of government. And as you can see, there were many aspects of it that were copied by the United States when they established the American government. Now let's talk a little bit about how this empire was created. First, Rome had to conquer Italy. They were constantly at war with all of the little neighboring tribes around the city of Rome. They expanded, brought these people under subjugation, and then the Romans did an incredibly creative thing. They offered Roman citizenship to any of the people that were conquered. Sometimes they said to the entire city, if you agree, you can become Roman citizens. Sometimes they offered citizenship to only the leaders of the city that was conquered, with the idea that they would become Roman citizens, and then others, as they qualified, could become Roman citizens. And you might say, well, what were the advantages of citizenship? There were legal advantages. For instance, there were some laws that were just not applicable to Roman citizens. In addition, there were other laws that if you were convicted of doing something wrong, you could appeal to go into the center and be heard by the consuls. And so you could appeal your conviction, and it had to be honored if you were a Roman citizen. Perhaps even more of an incentive was the fact that Roman citizens paid no taxes. And therefore, as Rome gathered money from these conquered territory, if you were offered the right to be a citizen, you didn't have to surrender your money or pay any taxes ever to the city of Rome. Tremendous victory. Well, all throughout Italy, people picked up on this advantage, and as they saw Rome emerging as a powerful entity, they wanted to become part of it, and they did. There's an interesting story about that. There was a man who came from Greece. His name was King Pyrrhus. He felt that he could conquer the Romans, and he crossed over from Greece and attacked the Romans. He was very successful in his attack, and the Romans were scattered, and it looked like King Pyrrhus was going to overrun all of Italy. Well, the weather turned, and back in those days, during the winter, they didn't fight. So King Pyrrhus and his troops put up tents, and they camped for the winter. The next spring, they anticipated that they would be able to march on Rome and take it over easily. But the next spring, when he started to march toward Rome, he found that there was another army there, bigger than the one that he had defeated before. Oh, well, it was terrible. King Pyrrhus was frustrated, but he was very, very good in his military tactics, and he defeated the second army, but it took him all the summer long. At the end of that year, the Romans again were defeated, but King Pyrrhus had to camp outside the city of Rome again. The following year, King Pyrrhus gathered his troops, marched toward Rome, and he found that there was another army, even bigger than the one that he had defeated the year before. And it took him all summer long to fight, but eventually he won that battle, all of those battles, and defeated the Roman army. And he said, well, I'm too late in the year to conquer Rome, and I sense that if I camp out for another winter season, the Romans will come back with even another army. Therefore, though victorious, King Pyrrhus left the peninsula of Italy and returned to the peninsula of Greece. He was a victor, but he was defeated. And today in English we have the phrase a Pyrrhic victory after King Pyrrhus, and that's a victory that can be won but isn't worth the effort. And that's what happened. Now you might ask, how did the Romans get all of those armies together? The answer is very simple. They went among those people that they had defeated, convinced them that it was to their advantage to be part of Rome, continuous citizens, and help Rome defend themselves against King Pyrrhus. And so all of these non-Roman people came in all of the subsequent armies to help Rome in their defense. After the peninsula of Italy had been successfully conquered by the Romans, and most of the people had been made Roman citizens, Rome looked to expand beyond Italy, and they discovered, of course, that they needed a navy. At this time, they did not have a very strong navy, and they also looked at trade in their vicinity and noticed that it was dominated by the Carthaginians. Carthage was a city on the northernmost tip of Africa, not too far away from Sicily. And so the Romans realized that their competition was the Carthaginians. Remember here, by the way, the story of Dido and Aeneas, and you can see how Carthage came into play in actual Roman history. Well, the Romans captured a Carthaginian ship and just simply started to duplicate it. Eventually, after several years, they had a navy about as large as the Carthaginian navy. And so they fought a series of battles, both in the sea and eventually over on Africa, and some in Sicily, and the Romans were able to defeat the Carthaginians. And with that defeat, they took possession of Sicily, of Sardinia, and of Corsica, and they also started to gain possession of some other territories in Spain. But Carthage had already established a pretty powerful position in Spain, and there was a family, the Barca family, that was very powerful, and the son, grown man in the Barca family, was named Hannibal. He and his father decided that they would assert the power of the Carthaginians against the Romans. And so from Spain, they gathered a great army. They had some battles in Spain against the Roman colonies there. And then Hannibal decided that he would take his army and cross over the Pyrenees Mountains to the north in between Spain and France. And then they would go along the southern part of France and eventually come to the Alps that formed the border between France and Italy. He would then cross the Alps and descend down into Italy, where he would fight the Roman army. It's well known that Hannibal had elephants that he took on this trip with him. And so they went over the mountains, down into Italy, and Hannibal was tremendously successful for many, many years, fighting the Romans in Italy, almost always defeating the Romans and eventually trying to conquer the city of Rome, but never able to do it. Well, the Romans were panicked. Each year they tried to defeat Hannibal and they were unable to do it, much like the story of King Pyrrhus. But in this case, eventually, the Roman Senate chose a ruthless leader, and this ruthless leader decided the way to defeat Hannibal was not to confront him directly, but to cross over to Africa and attack directly the city of Carthage and force Hannibal to leave Italy and go and defend his home city of Carthage. So that's exactly what happened. The Roman army crossed over into Africa. They besieged Carthage. Hannibal crossed over to defend his city, and there in Africa, the Romans were able to finally defeat Hannibal and destroy the city of Carthage. Finally, there was a third war. And in that third war, the Romans were able to continue to fight against the Carthaginians. They were very successful, and in the end of the third war, again a Roman victory, they destroyed the city of Carthage, and we are told that they plowed salt into the soil. That may not be true, but at least it's a story that says how utterly destructive the Romans were at the end of the third war against Carthage. Now, these wars are not called the Carthaginian Wars because the Romans didn't call the Carthaginians Carthaginians. They called them Pone, because in the Roman mind, these people were Phoenicians. And so the Latin word for Phoenicians was Pone, and therefore these words were taken from that name, and they were called the Punic Wars. So there were 3 Punic Wars, and at the end of the Punic Wars, the Romans had conquered all of the Western Mediterranean, and they dominated trade throughout the entire Western Mediterranean. That is, everything to the west of the Italian peninsula. Then you might wonder what happened next, and that is the Romans simply started to expand to the east. Now the Romans had a tradition, and that tradition was that they never fought a war of aggression. They always had some reason that they had to fight a war. They were attacked by someone, or there was an embarrassment that the Romans had to correct, or a person invited them to come and they only were following the request of another person. Well, you might ask yourself the question, if the Romans never fought a war of aggression, how did they expand so widely? And you might then say, do you believe that they never fought a war of aggression? It seems almost unbelievable. But then you might also ask yourself the question, how does this compare to USA policy? In the United States, we have often said that we do not fight wars of aggression. We only fight defensive wars, or we fight wars where someone has created a situation that is so serious that we must change it. Well, in the Book of Mormon, we are given some policies of when it's appropriate to fight a war. Defense of home, defense of family, but not to fight under aggressive conditions if you are the aggressor. So those are some interesting things that the Americans believe about themselves, the Romans believed about themselves, but the Book of Mormon policies establish a slightly different point of view. Well, eventually Rome occupied and had conquered almost the entire Mediterranean. They were able to conquer Greece, in part because of aggravated attacks or attacks invited by others. They were able to conquer Syria, and in fact they had actually conquered almost all of the Mediterranean. The sole exception would be Egypt, and they had not yet conquered Egypt, but we will see that that happens now toward the end of the Roman Republic. How does the Republic end? A very interesting question. It actually began its demise about 150 years BC. There were two brothers, the Cracus brothers, who are perhaps the first and the most instrumental in the start of the fall of the Roman Republic. And what happened is that these Cracus brothers wanted their own way. They were unable to convince the Senate to agree with them, and therefore they just simply forced their way through physical violence on the Senate, assassinating people who would not agree with what they wanted. One brother ruled for a while. He used physical violence. He was eventually overthrown and killed. And then later, the second brother came to power, and he used physical violence to obtain his will, and he was eventually also overthrown. Nevertheless, a principle had been set, a principle of defiance of the law and enforcement by physical violence to attain one's personal aims. Later, another problem occurred because some of the rulers refused to accept the one-year terms that were imposed on almost all of the city offices, of the Roman offices, not just on consul. Almost all of the other offices also were for a one-year term. Along came a man named Sulla. There were terrible problems, and he was eventually elected to be a dictator. As you know, in this case, the term was only 6 months. But Sulla defied that. He stayed in office for a longer period of time than 6 months. And he actually had a general named Marius who allowed him to stay in office by taking control of the army and enforcing the army's will on the Senate. Well, Sulla eventually retired, and Marius came to power, and then Sulla tried to return. He disagreed with Marius after a while. Marius was able to defeat Sulla, and then Marius stayed on and remained as dictator for a longer period of time. That became a very, very serious problem, and they killed many people by choosing who would be their enemies or asking others to identify enemies and putting them on a list where they were identified to be killed. And a person who identified an enemy of Sulla could put that enemy on the list, that person would be killed, and then it was understood that Sulla would give that killed person's property to the one who identified them. You can imagine what chaos that kind of policy would have created in the Roman Republic. Well, eventually there were two parties that emerged within the Republic. One party was the party of the Senate. They were called the Optimates. They were conservatives. They wanted to return to the old values. They saw the terrible trends that had occurred in the recent past, and they wanted to go back to the days of Horatio at the Bridge and remember those wonderful, strong values that had created the Roman Republic to begin with. Some famous men of this type were Sulla himself, although he was a bit two-faced, but also Cato and Cicero. Cicero being a very famous philosopher who also came to power as one of the consuls. On the other side were a group of men called the Populares. They were in favor of giving more power to the plebs and allowing the people to continue to grow as a class as opposed to the patricians. Some famous names there would be Marius, and then in addition to him, Pompey and Julius Caesar. These were what we might call today liberals. They believed in change in the government and in giving more power to the people. Let's just look at a few of the values that Cicero enunciated, and I think that you'll find them to be very powerful. He said, for instance, "There is not a moment without a duty." A wonderful concept. Here's another. "In a republic, this rule ought to be observed, that the majority should not have the predominant power." He's obviously talking against the Populares, but here he is suggesting that there should be some check and balance even against the will of the majority. And in the United States, we have accepted that. We have several checks and balances against the will of the majority. For instance, we have the Supreme Court, and they can say that a law, even though the majority of the people have supported it, can be unconstitutional and therefore would be struck down. We also have institutions where initially we did not have direct election of the Senate. That was done by the state legislatures. Or where we have the Electoral College, where the people do not directly elect the president, but it goes to the Electoral College for the election. So there are a series of checks and balances, and we have gotten that idea from the ancient Romans, and Cicero here enunciates it. Here's another statement by Cicero. "The national budget must be balanced. The public debt must be reduced. The arrogance of the authorities must be moderated and controlled. Payments to foreign governments must be reduced if Rome doesn't want to become bankrupt. People must, again, learn to work instead of living on public assistance." Why, I think there are any number of politicians today in the United States that could have said almost exactly those words. And here's another one. "There is nothing so absurd or ridiculous, but some philosopher has said it." I think that's just a delightful comment on philosophy by a philosopher. Well, the man who actually brought to an end the Roman Republic was Julius Caesar. You may not have thought of him in these terms, but let me explain to you how it happened. In Julius Caesar's early life, he was a typical Roman, born of a very good family, and like all public-minded Romans, he worked his way through various steps within the government. He was at some time governor of Spain. He was also the chief religious officer of the Roman Republic. And eventually, he was appointed to be a consul. And he agreed to be a consul under special conditions. It was called a triumvirate. Now, triumvirate means three people, and if you remember, consuls always two. And so here we see a deviation from the normal pattern, and it was not liked. And yet, Julius Caesar and the other two people who ruled with him were so powerful that there was nothing the Senate or anyone else could do about it. And so during this period of time, Caesar asked his other two members of the triumvirate to appoint him governor of Gaul. Now, Gaul is that area north of Italy that we call France. And it had largely been unconquered at this time. It was a wild territory. The Gauls were a barbarian people, and Caesar felt that it was to his glory and to the benefit of Rome if that territory could be conquered. Therefore, Caesar was given the responsibility of conquering Gaul, and he was made the governor of all of Gaul. Julius Caesar was tremendously successful in Gaul. He conquered all of Gaul, but in addition to that, he made a brief but successful incursion into Germany and a brief but successful incursion into Britain. Then, during the time that he was in Gaul, he sensed that there were problems in Rome. One of the two other members of the triumvirate, a man named Crassus, had been sent by the group to Asia, where he was actually killed in war. That left just two members of the triumvirate. And one of them was Pompey, and the other was Caesar. And Pompey began to want personal power, gathering that power to himself. And when he did that, he worried Caesar. And so Caesar saw that Pompey's power was an attempt perhaps to cut him out of power. So Caesar decided that he would come down and confront Pompey. He took his troops down to a northern river in Italy, with Caesar's troops on one side of that river and tradition on the other side. That tradition being, if a general crosses this river, the Rubicon, in military power, then he has violated his oath against Rome, and he is an outlaw and can be attacked by any group that wants to defend Rome. That tradition was very powerful, but Caesar knew that if he kept that tradition, then Pompey would defeat him and Caesar would be excluded. So Caesar, on the edge of the Rubicon, made his decision that he wanted to cross that river, and then he had to convince his troops to cross the river. Here we have a short film showing Caesar and his troops on the bank of the Rubicon. Look at how creatively Caesar acts to convince his troops to cross that river.
Any of your people I can mention?
Titus Pullo took the head off the first man that came at me.
Soldiers, Pompey and the Senate have formally declared that Gaius Julius Caesar is an enemy of Rome. They have declared that I am a criminal. They have declared, in effect, that all of you also are criminals. Tribune's veto was not exercised. People's Tribune Mark Antony and 50 men of the 13th were assaulted by 1,000 head of Pompeian scum. A tribune of the plebs assaulted on the steps of the Senate House. Can you imagine a more terrible sacrilege? Our beloved republic is in the hands of madmen. This is a dark day, and I stand at a fork in the road. I can abide the law and surrender my arms to the Senate and watch the republic fall to tyranny and chaos. Or I can go home with my sword in my hand and run those maniacs to the Tarpeian Rock! Legionary Titus Pullo, step forward. Titus Pullo. When 50 brave men of the 13th fought Pompey's 1,000 in the Forum and saved the Tribune, it was legionary Titus Pullo drew first blood. Here's 500 denarii.
Very grateful, sir.
Are you with me, Titus Pullo? Will you come with me to Rome?
Yes. Yes, sir. Certainly.
Titus Pullo is with me. And you? Are you with me?
When Caesar crossed the river and took his army south into Italy, he was able to defeat Pompey, not only there, but as Pompey fled to other locations, Caesar followed him and beat him in many other places, including in Asia, where Caesar put down rebellion. That is when he uttered the famous statement, "Veni vidi vici," which means I came, I saw, I conquered. Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt. And there, when he arrived, following Pompey by about 2 weeks, the king of Egypt, whose name was Ptolemy, a young boy, had killed Pompey, and he presented Pompey's head to Caesar. Caesar was very angry, not that Pompey had been killed, but that Ptolemy, a non-Roman, would have taken it upon himself to kill a Roman general. Caesar also became angry at Ptolemy for another reason. Ptolemy wanted to restrict the people that Caesar could speak with. In particular, Ptolemy did not want Caesar to talk to Ptolemy's sister, Cleopatra. But Cleopatra, very, very bright, knew that she could influence Caesar. So, even though she was excluded from the palace, she had her servants roll her up in a rug and carry the rug into Caesar, suggesting that this was a gift to Caesar from Cleopatra. They were able to get the rug into Caesar's presence, and there the servants unrolled the rug and Cleopatra jumped up. And there she met Caesar and did impress him. Caesar and Cleopatra had an affair, and they had a child, a little boy named Caesarion. Then Cleopatra and Caesar eliminated Cleopatra's brother, and they took control over Egypt, Cleopatra being the queen, Caesar being the power behind the queen. Eventually, Caesar returned to Rome. He brought Cleopatra back with him. It was a huge, tremendous success. But Cleopatra offended the Romans because of the opulence, the power that she showed, the money that she showed. And it frightened many of the people in Rome. Not only that, remember that there was still this tremendous battle between the populares and the optimates, and Caesar became ever more of a populare. And then there was the problem of the kingship. Let me tell you what happened there. Caesar, at one occasion, went to the plebeian council, sat in front of the plebeians. There's a rock where the plebeian council met, just underneath that rock, the rock being in the Forum. Actually, it's in front of the House of the Senate. So with the senators even looking at what Caesar was doing, he sat on the rock, and there were the plebeians gathered in front of him. And Caesar was very popular with the plebeians, and at the height of his popularity, Caesar's best friend, Mark Antony, came next to Caesar and said to the plebeians, "Would you like Caesar to be your king?" Caesar, we think, expected that they would say yes. But the tradition of the Roman Republic was too strong, and the people said, "No, no, we don't want him to be our king. We want him to be Caesar, just Caesar." Caesar then said, "Well, of course I wouldn't have accepted king anyway." A few weeks later, the very same thing happened. Caesar was sitting in front of the plebeian council. Mark Antony said again, "I think we should make Caesar our king." And again, evidently to Caesar's surprise, the people refused to allow that to happen, and Caesar again denied it. But the Senate knew about it, and they were angry because they saw through Caesar's ruse. They knew that Caesar wanted to be king, and it scared them, especially those among them who were the Optimates. Therefore, on March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar went to a meeting of the Senate, and there he was stabbed by 20 senators, including among them Brutus, who was Caesar's illegitimate son. The motives? Probably optimates versus populares. There were also some personal grievances against Caesar, perhaps even a desire to kill this man who would be king. Julius Caesar's, or the play Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, suggests that, perhaps above all others, is the reason for the action of the conspirators. Let's take a look at a brief film from the Shakespearean movie of Julius Caesar.
Et tu, Brute! And fall, Caesar.
Liberty! Freedom! Tyranny is dead! Run hence! Proclaim! Cry it about the streets! Some to the common pulpits! And cry out, liberty! Freedom and enfranchisement! People and senators, be not affrighted!
We see that was a bloody occurrence, one that was surprising to Caesar. Let's ask ourselves this question. Are there acts which should not be done even to correct tyranny or evil? Or if the evil is bad enough, are we obligated to do anything, even kill the person? Reminded of the attempted assassinations of Hitler, or perhaps others, Saddam Hussein. Are there evil people who need to be killed regardless? And you can decide for yourselves whether Caesar should have been killed or some of these other despots. An interesting situation that Shakespeare so cleverly and brilliantly focuses on is the way that Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and best friend, insinuated himself into the compact of the conspirators. He comes into the room while the conspirators have decided to take an oath. They've bloodied their hands together and shaken these bloodied hands in an oath of allegiance. And then in comes Mark Antony, interrupts them, and then pleads with them for a chance to say his piece, and says, I owe you no ill. And then he shakes their hand, that same bloodied hand, and he has not taken their oath, thereby disrupting the very oath that they have pledged. Here's a video from the movie Julius Caesar.
Let us bathe our hands in Caesar's blood. Then walk we forth even to the marketplace, and waving our red weapons o'er our heads, let's all cry peace, freedom, and liberty.
Stoop then and wash. How many ages hence shall this our lofty scene be acted o'er? States unborn and accents yet unknown.
Shall we forth? Aye, every man away. Brutus shall lead, and we will grace his heels with the most boldest and best hearts of Rome.
Soft. Who comes here? Welcome, Mark Antony.
Almighty Caesar, dost thou lie so low? Are all thy conquests, glories, triumphs, spoils, shrunk to this little measure? Fare thee well.
Oh, Antony, beg not your death of us, though now we must appear bloody and cruel, as by our hands, and this our present act you see we do. Yet see you but our hands, and this the bleeding business they have done. Our hearts you see not. They are pitiful. For your part, to you our swords have leaden points, Mark Antony.
I doubt not of your wisdom. Let each man render me his bloody hand. First, Marcus Brutus, will I shake with you. Next, Caius Cassius, do I take your hand. Caesar, if thy spirit look upon us now, shall it not grieve thee dearer than thy death to see thy Antony making his peace, shaking the bloody fingers of thy foes, most noble in the presence of thy corpse?
Now let's take a look at the movie of Mark Antony's speech, where he now gives those famous words, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." And yet he goes on to praise him and turns the crowd from an anti-Caesarian crowd to a pro-Caesarian crowd. And they demand the justice against the conspirators, and thus the Roman Republic is plunged into a civil war.
Let us hear him.
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it was so, it was a grievous fault. Grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable men. Come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious. And Brutus is an honorable man. Bear with me. My heart is there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me.
Methinks there is much reason in his sayings. If thou consider rightly of the matter, Caesar has had a great wrong.
Has he, masters? I fear there will a worse come in his place.
Mark ye his words. He would not take the crown. Therefore, 'tis certain he was not ambitious.
There's not a nobler man in Rome than Antony.
But yesterday, the word of Caesar might have stood against the world. Now lies he there, and none so poor to do him reverence. Stand far off. You all do know this mantle. I remember the first time ever Caesar put it on. It was on a summer's evening in his tent. That day he overcame the Nervii. Look, in this place ran Cassius' dagger through. Oh, see what a rent the envious Casca made. Through here, the well-beloved Brutus stabbed. And as he plucked his cursed steel away, Marco, the blood of Caesar, followed it. For Brutus, as you know, was Caesar's angel. Judge, O ye gods, how dearly Caesar loved him. For this was the most unkindest cut of all. For when the noble Caesar saw him stab, ingratitude, more strong than traitor's arms, quite vanquished him. Then burst his mighty heart, and in his mantle muffling up his face, even at the base of Pompey's statue, which all the while ran blood, great Caesar fell. Oh, what a fall was there, my countrymen. And I and you and all of us fell down, whilst bloody treason flourished over us. Kind soul, what? Weep you when you but behold our Caesar's vesture wounded? Look you here!
Mark Antony is the leader of one group in the Civil War, and he joins forces with Caesar's nephew, a man named Octavian. Octavian had been designated by Caesar as his heir. These men form a great army, and they go and fight the conspirators. Eventually, Mark Antony and Octavian are successful. The conspirators die, their army is defeated. Mark Antony and Octavian divide the Roman Empire into two parts, each one taking control over one of those two parts. Mark Antony takes the part in the east, the Greek-speaking area to the east of Italy. That includes Egypt. Octavian takes the western part, and he is headquartered in Rome. Eventually, Mark Antony and Octavian quarrel, and they quarrel over the behavior of Mark Antony. He has become involved with Cleopatra, and that is especially offensive to Octavian because Mark Antony was married to Octavian's sister. Well, Octavian decides that he will go and do the right that needs to be done and conquer Mark Antony. So the civil war continues, now with two other opposing heads, Mark Antony and Octavian. Eventually, Mark Antony and Octavian meet, and Octavian is victorious. Cleopatra is a supporter of Mark Antony. She flees to Egypt at the end of their unsuccessful naval engagement. Mark Antony also flees, and then the two of them commit suicide. And here's a little video showing Mark Antony and Cleopatra.
Antony's alliance with Augustus withered. He and Cleopatra mobilized, but Augustus struck first. The poet Virgil later cast the battle as an epic struggle of East against West.
Standing high on the stern, Augustus leads the Italians into battle, carrying with him the might of the Senate and the people. Opposing him with barbarian wealth is Antony, suited for battle. He carries with him the powers of the Orient, and, to the scandal of all, his Egyptian wife. Their monstrous divinities raise weapons against our noble Roman gods.
Three-quarters of the Egyptian fleet was destroyed. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide, and the land of the pharaohs was formally annexed to the Roman Empire.
The Roman Republic is now dead. What was the cause of this downfall? It appears that it was caused by the loss of the very values that the Roman Republic held to be most important: personal integrity, respect for law, family values. What could have been done to save the Republic? Well, had the Senate been stronger, perhaps they could have resisted the Gracchus brothers, or Sulla, or Marius, or even Julius Caesar. Perhaps they could have solved the problems without resorting to violence. When they formed the two parties, the Optimates and the Populares, was that beneficial or detrimental? It's good to have discussion, but is it good to have such terrible, deep-seated disagreements that these two groups end up fighting each other, perhaps even killing people on the other side? That, of course, leads us to the question, is it good for the United States to have two parties? Well, probably yes, but is there a limit to the disagreement between these two parties? Is there a time when the parties have to pull together to change, to become a united front? And even if that means election of one party or the other, is that something to be preferred versus a continual disagreement? On the other hand, maybe we need the two opinions so that we can always make an informed choice. You might also ask, was Julius Caesar's death justified? If he wanted to be king, and that was the reason for the formation of the Republic, to stop anyone from ever being a king, was his death perhaps inevitable because he was defying the basic tenet of the formation of the Roman Republic? But surely, with his death and the civil war that subsequently followed, we have the end of the Roman Republic. Thank you very much.